Hello everyone, and welcome to this, our fourth video, dealing with preparation of a research paper. And today I hope we'll get to the end of the sequence, which has dealt with storyboarding, and then with outlining, and then with drafting, and now with preparation of introduction and conclusion, and that'll be relating to chapter 10 from Turabian. So before we get there, what I'll do is just run through the questions that I posed in relation to chapters 7 and 9 from Turabian. Thanks very much for your answers. It's good to have those, and I'm glad to say that pretty much everyone answered appropriately. Let's just work through the questions to review them for everyone's benefit. Question 1 asked as to whether Turabian recommends producing a complete draft or working instead in a series of shorter goal-directed spans. And the advice is very much to work in goal-directed spans, so not to try to write everything at a single sitting. Question 2, Turabian advocated 3 points for the review of a draft, and what were they? They were to check the reasoning to make sure that it's consistent, to check the location of ideas, and also to read through and take note of the appearance, the appropriate appearance of key terms and concepts. Question 3, when incorporating sources, Turabian advises distinguishing amongst 3 modes of integration, and what are they? We talked about these in one of the classes before the mid-semester break, before spring break, but to reiterate them, they are summary, paraphrase, and quotation. And there are different reasons for choosing each of those, which Turabian again reviews for us. Question 4 then, let's move on. How should a quotation of 5 or more lines be presented? And the answer is as a block, so not run into the text. Shorter than that can be run directly into the text, so a 1 or 2 line quotation shouldn't be included as a block. By a block we mean indent left and right side, and also justified left and right side. So it's clear that this is a quotation and it is set off typographically. Question 5. Turabian gives examples of text links that make the insertion of a quotation work smoothly. So, should authors that we then cite be identified by their professional titles, and must their full name be given on every occasion? So, no professional titles are required, whether doctor or professor. And must their full name be given on every occasion? No. I see many submissions of final documents that come in for either master's or DMA or PhD, and they typically tend to be rather loose on this. So remember, full name on first introduction, and then subsequently you can use a surname, the family name of the author. That's fine to do, but full name first of all. And that can be in the very first chapter, and subsequent to that you just use the family name or surname. Question 6. When addressing the question of coherence, now we're moving on to chapter 9. That's previously been raised by Wingell and Herzog. So the question of coherence, Turabian identifies 6 points to consider. What are they? So that's on page 103 of chapter 9, and section 9.3 asks you to check what key terms run through all of the sections, where each section and subsection ends and the next begins, how each section relates to the one before it, what role each section plays in the whole, what sentence in each section and subsection states its point, and lastly, what distinctive key terms run throughout each section. Question 7. Does Turabian recommend organising paragraphs so that they are of identical length? No. Paragraphs can be of varying lengths, but they need to have a sort of medium, sort of comparative length, so that a hyper-extended paragraph simply probably needs breaking down several times. Often when you see work that is poorly prepared, it tends to just break down into a paragraph every single line, and that just looks completely incoherent. So try to avoid that. Think of paragraphs as being relatively the same length, but they can be varied. Last of all then, question 8. Should the revised draft, we're feeling triumphant that it's over, should we just turn around straight away and try to correct it there and then? And the answer is definitely not. At least take time out overnight to just stop and then to come back again. Don't leave things too late, and there will be time for this, and it really is a very helpful thing to do to make your work read most effectively and to do the best job of which you're capable. Okay. So there are the questions, and I'm going to move on then to look at chapter 10 of Turabian, and this is dealing with the final introduction and conclusion. So we're happy with the rest of the draft, and Turabian says, right, okay, what you need to do now is to look through your introduction and your conclusion. That's the first thing people will say, and they'll make a judgment on that. Then the last thing you say, that's what your readers will remember, which is why it's important to try and put extra effort into these two passages from anything that you do right. So let's begin on page 106. There's not a long section through to page 112, but at the beginning, Turabian says that the completion of a final version of the introduction and the conclusion requires framing, which in the former case, that's for the introduction, engages readers, and in the case of the conclusion, ultimately consolidates their understanding. The introduction has three main aims. Firstly, to contextualize in relation to prior research. Secondly, to specify the problem with which readers should be able to identify. And thirdly, to indicate a framework in relation to which this problem might be understood. So it's trying to draw readers in under those terms. So here's the first of 6 questions. Question 1. How much of the paper overall should the introduction occupy, and should the conclusion be longer or shorter than this? Should the conclusion be longer or shorter than the introduction? How long should the introduction be in relation to the overall paper? Question 2. What are the 3 principal aims of the conclusion? We talked about the introduction, but what are the 3 principal aims of the conclusion? Turabian goes on to say that the introduction is really organised in 4 parts if it's done well. Firstly, context. Secondly, the research question. Thirdly, the significance of that question. And fourthly, the author's claim, the claim the author wants to put forward and is going to try and clarify and validate as the paper unfolds. So let's work through each of those. Turabian says that in the first case, context, this can be abbreviated if the context is very well known. But it can be a synopsis if your paper is intended for a general readership, or it will involve citations if it's targeted at a specialist readership. So we'll think about what we're doing now with the recording survey of the Beethoven composition. Maybe synoptic is the idea that we have here, but for a final paper for a DMA or for an MM, then that will involve actual citation of sources because the readership will be specialised. So question 3. Which 2 words show that the second element, the question, is expected to modify existing assumptions? Which 2 English words show that the question, the second element, is expected to modify, to alter existing assumptions? Moving on. The third segment, the sense of significance that the reader is supposed to identify with, is established, they say, by stating the consequences of not providing a satisfactory answer. What is, in other words, the sort of misunderstanding that will arise if we don't come up with a satisfactory answer to the question? Hence, the 4th section, the author's claim, is advanced as provisional. That is, it's set up as a kind of proposition, which the author is then going to answer through detailed exposition and evaluation. That's certainly what will happen in this particular exercise, comparing the recordings. Question 4 then. They say that 3 cliches should be avoided. In other words, 3 overused tendencies that authors might adopt. What are those cliches? What are those overly familiar ways of opening up a paper, a discussion paper, and what should we term them? So they give specific terms. They say avoid these temptations, avoid actually resorting to these ideas. Instead, the recommendation is to begin with perhaps a quotation, a striking fact about the piece, and certainly if we go to the versions that are available of pieces that have been presented, as in the case of BBC's Building a Library, that's very often what happens. We might have a quotation, but certainly a striking fact about the piece is common. Or a relevant anecdote. Also, that might be used. Some source from history, which is interesting, and then again draws in a reader, or in this case, a listener, to think about that piece. But you can also synthesize all 3, says Turabian, as long as all of them together touch on the key terms that will be discussed throughout the remainder of the paper. So you can have all 3 together, so long as the key terms are not lost. That's actually going to be a kind of resonant part of the remainder of the paper. Now, question 5. Should the conclusion simply restate the main points of the introduction in identical order? So again, referring to Turabian, should the conclusion simply restate the main points of the introduction in identical order? These points, Turabian does consider and says this, that restating the central claim must be sort of done in relation to its most complete and specific form. So the central claim must be reiterated here in its most complete and specific form. Its significance must again be made clear, but now with regard to the potential new relevance and practical applications that this particular claim is now able to validate. It can't answer everything there and then, however, so the third idea is to think about what prospects may arise from it for further research. And in the case of a recording, let's say, that might be, okay, here's an excellent version of this piece. In some ways, it either breaks ground or it establishes and reiterates the sort of traditional modes of interpretation that performers have brought to bear on it, or conductors have thought through. What about future performances? That's also possible to do. Can we see general tendencies whereby this might be kept alive, or actually innovation becomes more widespread and more widely adopted? Last question then, question 6. When should the title be written? And why is a 2-part title to be preferred? Well, we know what our title is going to be, and it will be 2-part. So it's going to be Building a Library, and it's going to be the piece by Beethoven that you're working on. But when should the title, if you're inventing your own, be written? Certainly, say, for your document, for your thesis or your dissertation, when should the title of that be written? And why is a 2-part title to be preferred? Okay, that's everything I think I wanted to say. I'll put the link in an email. And if you could let me have responses, I think I'm asking for about 1 o'clock on Thursday. Now do try to get them in then. Pretty much everyone did. A couple of people were late. Try to avoid it. I know sometimes things get in the way, but it really is helpful to me if things come in at 1 o'clock on Thursday. That's what I think I'm asking for. So try to remember that. Certainly don't forget it. All right. Thanks a lot. I hope everyone's doing okay in this strange period of history, and I will be in touch again, probably release another video on Friday. So hope for your answers coming in Thursday, and I will send you another video for consideration, post another video on YouTube on Friday. Okay, thanks a lot everybody. Goodbye for now.